If you're curious where to start with your own fantasy map creation, I wanted to show an example of some of the methods I use to create one. This stems from some thoughtful questions I had in the comments on a previous video, and one of the methods you could use is simply reaching for some common household objects around your desk. I've got a sponge, post-it notes, the lid to my water, a talking 8-ball that shouts at me. I find it very funny. A crystal, a little sphinx statue, and a hair tie. And then I just loosely trace around them, keeping in mind that coastlines sometimes can be jagged or smooth. So it's just a rough suggestion of where the land masses or water bits might be. Once you're done tracing, you get to decide which part's land and which part's water. Really, they're completely interchangeable until you put the paint down. For this map, I decided that the land was going to be on the left where the stuff is, and the water was going to be on the right. So I'm already starting to visualize in my mind what I'd like it to look like. And I thought it would be cool to try some unconventional colors. So this is a fantasy map, and I've decided that my fantasy place is going to be orange and pink. I misted the paper before I began just to give it a little bit of moisture, and then I took azo orange and I'm just dragging it down the paper. I did not pre-wash the paper with just clear water. I just used a little bit of mist and then the pigment itself, and I sprayed it as I went along because I live in Colorado. It's a very dry state, so I only have a couple of seconds for watercolor to dry here, whereas if you lived in a place that had a bit more humidity, you would have longer. Once my first wash of the land, azo orange, had dried, I went in with some cobalt teal. I did not spray the paper before I started because the edges would bleed into the land. So cobalt teal, it's got some heavy sediment in there, and it really adds to the texture of the ocean and lakes. So I really like that effect, so that's usually why I start with a cobalt teal as my first wash for the bodies of water. So as soon as I finish laying in this cobalt teal, I want to make sure that it's completely dry before I do my second wash on the land. I want to make sure there aren't any accidental blooms or bleeds, nothing like that. So I just happen to have some Quin pink on my palette, so that's what I decided would be neat to use for the second wash of the land. And why I'm doing this in 2 layers or 2 washes is because it really gives depth to the land. Some of it's intentional and some of it's accidental, and the accidental part is the fun part in watercolors, and that's why I like to use it for maps. Once I lay in the pink, you'll see that I'm using clear water to extend the pigment to the edges of the land. So I'm not taking full pink and going right to the water. I'm leaving a bit of orange, and then I'm using a clean brush in clean water, and I basically trace around the areas I was painting. As that dries, everything will kind of mellow out. The pink will move into that clean water area, and it will fade into there. So there'll be these nice faded spaces rather than harsh edges. For the deeper water of the ocean, I used ultramarine, and I also used some random greens and purples that I happen to have on my palette as well, just for fun, just to see what it looks like. You know, it's okay to experiment, especially in fantasy maps. I mean, it's your world. You can truly create whatever is in your head and put it on a map. Once I'm certain that everything has fully dried, and you can test this by touching it with the back of your hand. Once everything's fully dried, I like to go around the edges of the land masses with white gouache, or in this case for the lakes, I blended in a bit of orange because I didn't want that white to stand out too much for the lakes. I'm also brushing in a couple of waves on the coast, like waves that you would see from above if you were in a helicopter over this land. And I think it gives the players something to let their eyes wander on while you're coming up with what we're going to do next in the party. So I'm just finishing up the coastline with white gouache, and it's this just tiny brush that I'm going along and adding some waves for fun and texture. And now I have to start thinking about how I want to do the compass rose. So definitely bottom right. I'm going to use some tape, the same kind of tape that I use for holding the painting. I put a link in the description of this video of all of my materials I'm using. So if you're at a loss and some of your materials aren't quite working out, you can try some of my methods. So here we are with the compass rose, and I'm just going to put a layer of white gouache, and then I'm going to blend it out with some water and see how that looks. I've never tried this before, so it's just fun to experiment. Okay, the tape method didn't quite work. It didn't give me clean lines, so I'm using a combo of that Quinn pink watercolor and a little bit of white gouache, and then letting that dry, and then adding with a liner brush some white gouache on the top to see if I can make that compass rose stand out. One of the questions was on the placement of different little curiosities on the map, like landmarks. Really, I just kind of make them up as I go. I space them out randomly. I try not to have them too close together, maybe 4 or 5 tiles apart. Some of them are actually something the players can discover, like treasure or enemies, and some of them are just nice monuments to look at. And part of the fun is you never know what is going to be there, so the players are too curious to leave them alone. And here's the most satisfying part: removing that tape, and you want to drag it down and away slowly from the map. So here's a close-up tour of the map. You can see every 4 or 5 tiles we've got something interesting on there, like grasses, caves, palm trees, just fun things for the group to explore. And there you have it, a homemade fantasy map ready to play. Thanks for joining me in my map tutorial. I hope this was a helpful and informative video and has perhaps inspired you to try your own map. I have a list of all of my materials in the description, so if you happen to be missing any supplies, you can use those links. I also have other videos with some fun experiments, so if you want to see different ways to use watercolor and gouache, go ahead and click around. Thanks for joining. See you next time.